The village of Como had never seen a man like Pastor Ziba before. He arrived one rainy season when the sky rumbled with thunder and the rivers swelled with water. His arrival was not grand. He walked into the village alone, carrying only a wooden staff and a small leather bag slung over his shoulder. His voice, deep and commanding, carried through the air like the call of a great horn. "Come, my children," he proclaimed. "God has sent me to heal your wounds, to open your eyes, and to bless your homes." At first, the villagers were skeptical. They had seen men who called themselves prophets before, men who shouted into the wind, promising blessings but delivering nothing. But Pastor Ziba was different. The first miracle happened in the village square. A blind man named Didi, who had not seen the sun in over 20 years, sat under the baobab tree, as he did every day, begging for food. Pastor Ziba approached him, placed his hands upon the man's face, and whispered words no one could understand. A hush fell over the crowd. Suddenly, Didi gasped. His milky white eyes cleared, and he blinked rapidly. Then, he cried out, "I can see. I can see." He fell to his knees, sobbing. The people gasped in shock. How was this possible? But that was only the beginning. A woman named Adia, who had walked with a twisted back for years, stepped forward. "Man of God, if you are truly sent by the Most High, heal me." Pastor Ziba looked at her, his eyes filled with what seemed like kindness and power. "Rise," he commanded. And just like that, Adia stood straight, stretching her back as if she had never been in pain before. She let out a cry of joy and began to dance, her feet kicking up the dust. Word of Pastor Ziba spread like wildfire. People traveled from neighboring villages, carrying their sick on wooden mats, seeking his healing touch. The crippled walked, the deaf heard, and even a woman who had been barren for 10 years suddenly found herself with child after a single prayer from the pastor. It was as if the heavens had sent a savior to Como. Even the king, Oba Anezi, summoned Pastor Ziba to the palace. The Oba was an old man, his body weary with age, but his mind as sharp as a hunter's spear. He watched the pastor carefully, his wise eyes taking in every detail. "You are a man of great power," the king said. "Tell me, what is the source of your strength?" Pastor Ziba smiled. "It is God, my king. He has given me the power to heal his people." The Oba nodded slowly. "Then let the gods bear witness to your truth," he said. He gestured toward his daughter, Princess Olana, who had been mute since birth. "If you can make my daughter speak," the king continued, "then I shall know you are truly sent by God." A hush fell over the court. The princess, beautiful but silent, lowered her gaze. Many had tried before, herbs, prayers, sacrifices, nothing had worked. Pastor Ziba stepped forward and placed his hands on her head. He closed his eyes and whispered something strange, something old. The air in the room grew heavy, as if the spirits themselves had gathered to watch. Then, the princess gasped. She clutched her throat, eyes wide with shock. "My father," she cried. Her voice rang through the hall, clear and strong. The palace erupted into cheers. The king himself rose to his feet, his face filled with awe. "You are a man of wonders," he declared. "From this day forward, you will be the spiritual guide of this kingdom." But far away, deep in the forest, an old woman sat by a fire, stirring a pot of herbs. Her name was Momanchib, and she was the oldest healer in Como. She had lived long enough to see many things, good men, bad men, and those who walked the path in between. Her granddaughter, Kesa, ran to her, breathless. "Grandmother, have you heard? Pastor Ziba made a crippled boy walk today. Even the princess can now speak." Momanchib did not look up from her pot. She stirred slowly, her wrinkled fingers steady. "Miracles have their roots," she murmured. "Some grow from light, others from darkness. Kesa frowned. What do you mean? Mama Chib lifted her old, knowing eyes to her granddaughter. The wind does not carry a scent without reason. Watch, my child. The truth will reveal itself. But at that time, no one in the village wanted to listen to old women and their riddles. Pastor Ziba was a man of God. His miracles were proof. Or so they thought. The village of Como was alive with celebration. Every evening, people gathered in the village square, clapping their hands and singing praises for Pastor Ziba. Women carried clay pots filled with palm wine, men roasted goats over open fires, and children ran through the streets, shouting his name. Pastor Ziba. The man of wonders. He had become more than a prophet, he was a legend. People no longer called him simply Pastor Ziba. Now, he was the Anointed One. The great square, where traders once sold their wares, was transformed into a temple. A grand altar was built, decorated with white cloth and burning incense. Every morning, the sick and the desperate lined up, waiting for their turn to be healed. Come forward, my children. Pastor Ziba called, standing tall before the crowd. His white robe shimmered in the golden light of dawn. The power of God is here. One by one, they came forward, and one by one, they were healed. A young girl with a swollen belly was cured with a single touch. An old fisherman, whose hands had grown weak with age, suddenly found himself strong again, able to cast his net into the river with the force of a young man. Even a cow that had refused to give milk for months suddenly began to produce rich, thick milk after Pastor Ziba laid his hands upon it. The people were in awe. But not everyone was celebrating. In the quiet corners of the village, whispers began to spread. His power is great, an old man murmured to his neighbor, but have you noticed? He never prays like our fathers did. He does not call on the gods of our ancestors. He does not even call on Jesus in the way the old missionaries taught. Yes, another whispered. And have you seen his eyes when he heals? For a moment, they turn black, like the night without a moon. Some dismissed these whispers, calling them jealousy. You old men do not understand, they said. Pastor Ziba is sent by God. That is why he does not do things like ordinary men. But deep in the forest, Mama Chib listened to the wind. She sat on her mat, her wrinkled hands tracing patterns in the dirt. Kesa, her granddaughter, sat beside her, her wide eyes filled with curiosity. Grandmother, the whole village sings his name, Kesa said. Even the king trusts him. Why do you still doubt? Mama Chib picked up a handful of white cowrie shells and let them fall onto the ground. She studied the way they landed, her eyes dark with thought. My child, she said, a river that looks calm on the surface may hide strong currents below. What do you mean? Kesa asked, leaning forward. Pastor Ziba is powerful, yes, Mama Chib said, but where does his power come from? She pointed to the trees. The baobab tree is strong because its roots go deep into the earth. A man's power must also have roots. If the roots are from the light, they will bear good fruit. But if the roots are from darkness? She shook her head. Kesa shivered. But how can we know? Mama Chib looked into the flames of her fire. We must watch. We must listen. And when the time is right, we will see the truth. That night, as the village slept, a strange thing happened. The wind howled through the trees, carrying a sound, soft at first, then louder. It was not the cry of an animal, nor the whisper of the night birds. It was something else. Something unnatural. Mama Chib, sitting by her fire, stiffened. She turned her head sharply, her old bones creaking. She knew that sound. It was the call of the spirits. And they were warning her. The night was restless. The wind blew through the village of Komu, rustling the leaves of the great baobab tree, whispering secrets only the wise could hear. In the distance, the cries of a lone night bird echoed across the land, sending shivers down the spines of those still awake. Mama and Chip sat outside her hut, her eyes glowing in the dim firelight. She listened to the wind, felt the shifting of the earth beneath her, and knew that something was wrong. "Kesa," she called softly. Her granddaughter stirred from where she sat, dozing beside the fire. She rubbed her eyes and blinked at her grandmother. "Yes, grandmother. Take this calabash and fetch me water from the sacred well." Kesa frowned. "Now. But it is late. The spirits walk at this hour." Mama and Chip's voice was firm. "And that is why I must see what they are saying. Go now, child." Kesa hesitated but obeyed. She grabbed the calabash and hurried off into the night, her heart pounding with every step. The sacred well was at the edge of the village, near the forest where the spirits were said to gather. As she neared the well, the air grew colder. The night seemed darker, heavier. She could hear the distant beat of the village drums, the echoes of laughter from those still celebrating Pastor Ziba's miracles. But here, at the well, all was silent. She bent down to draw water, but as she did, she heard something, soft chanting, coming from deep within the forest. She froze, her hands trembling as she gripped the calabash. The voice was low, guttural, and filled with power. It was a language she did not recognize, but something about it made her blood run cold. Slowly, carefully, she crept toward the trees, peering into the darkness. And then she saw him. Pastor Ziba. He stood in a small clearing, his white robe flowing in the wind. But he was not alone. A dark figure loomed before him, taller than any man, its body wrapped in a swirling mist. Its eyes glowed red, like burning embers. The creature's voice rumbled through the night. "You have done well," it said. "The people trust you. They believe in you. Soon, they will be mine." Kesa gasped, clapping a hand over her mouth. Pastor Ziba bowed his head. "I have kept my promise," he said. "I have given them wonders. They follow me without question." The creature's voice slithered through the air. "Good. But do not forget, mortal, you serve me. Your power is not your own. The day you break your oath is the day I take everything from you." Pastor Ziba lifted his head, and for the first time, Kesa saw his eyes in the moonlight. They were not the warm, kind eyes the villagers knew. They were black. Empty. A void that swallowed the light. Kesa's heart pounded so loudly she feared they would hear it. She took a step back, but a dry twig snapped beneath her foot. Pastor Ziba's head snapped up. "Who's there?" The creature turned, its glowing eyes searching the darkness. Kesa's breath caught in her throat. She turned and ran, her feet barely touching the ground as she sprinted toward the village. Behind her, she heard a terrible, inhuman screech. The wind roared through the trees, and the ground seemed to tremble beneath her. She dared not look back. She ran until she reached her grandmother's hut, gasping for air. "Grandmother," she cried, falling to her knees. I saw. Mama and Chib was waiting. She knelt beside Kesa, holding her shaking hands. "Speak, child," she whispered. Kesa's voice trembled. "Pastor Ziba, he is not what he seems. He gets his power from something else. A creature. A demon." For a long time, Mama and Chib was silent. Then, she nodded. "The truth is beginning to show itself," she said. "But we must move carefully. The snake that hides in the grass is the most dangerous." Kesa shivered. "What do we do?" Mama and Chip stared into the fire, her eyes dark with thought. "We wait. And when the time comes, we strike." But neither of them knew that Pastor Ziba had already sensed the presence of an intruder. And he was coming for whoever had seen his secret. The village of Como rose with the sun, unaware that a dark secret had been whispered into the night. Women fetched water from the river, men tended to their farms, and children played under the great baobab tree. To them, all was well. Their beloved Pastor Ziba was still the anointed one, the man who had brought miracles to their land. But in Mom and Chip's heart, the truth sat like a heavy stone. Kesa had barely slept. The image of the dark creature, the glowing eyes, and Pastor Ziba's black stare haunted her. She could still hear the demon's voice, warning Ziba not to break his oath. "Grandmother, we must tell the people," she said, sitting up. "They trust him. They must know the truth." Mom and Chib, seated before the fire, shook her head. "If we tell them now, they will not believe us." "But, child," Mom and Chib interrupted, her voice low and firm, "you saw the power he wields. Do you think he will stand by and let us expose him?" Kesa swallowed. "Then what do we do?" The old woman sighed. "We wait for his greed to betray him. A man who drinks from a poison well will soon be too sick to hide his pain." Kesa frowned, but before she could say anything, a loud knock echoed through the hut. Boom! 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 The fire flickered. The air grew cold. Mom and Chib and Kesa exchanged a glance. "Who is it?" Mom and Chib called. A deep voice answered, smooth and commanding. "The Anointed One." Kesa's heart stopped. "Pastor Ziba." Mom and Chib slowly stood. "Enter." The door creaked open, and Pastor Ziba stepped inside. He was dressed in a long white robe, and around his neck hung a golden pendant, shaped like an open eye. His smile was warm, but his eyes, those deep, dark eyes, held no warmth at all. "My dear mother," he said, his voice dripping with honey. "I have come to bless you." Mom and Chib did not smile. "And what blessing do you bring, Pastor?" He stepped forward, looking from the old woman to Kesa. "A little bird whispered to me last night," he said. "It told me that someone was wondering where they should not have been." His gaze settled on Kesa. "Did you hear any whispers last night, my child?" Kesa clenched her fist. She could feel his power pressing against her, like a great weight in the air. She forced herself to meet his gaze. "No, Pastor." Pastor Ziba chuckled softly. "Good," he said. Then he turned to Mom and Chib. "You are wise, old one. I know you see things others do not. That is why I ask you, do not poison the people's hearts against me. God has chosen me to lead them." Mom and Chib held his gaze. A man chosen by God does not need to silence those who question him. Pastor Ziba's smile faltered for a moment. Then he stepped back. "May the gods bless you," he murmured, turning to leave. But before he stepped out, he looked at Kesa once more. "I will see you soon, little one." Then he was gone. The moment the door shut, Kesa let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Grandmother, he knows." Mom and Chib nodded gravely. "Yes. And now, he will try to silence us. But how can we stop him?" Kesa whispered. The old woman took a deep breath. "There is only one way to break a bond with darkness." Kesa leaned in. "How?" Mom and Chib's voice was barely above a whisper. "We must turn his own God against him." That night, the village gathered in the great square. A full moon shone overhead, casting long shadows across the land. Pastor Ziba stood before the altar, his arms raised high. "My children," he called. "Tonight, the power of the Most High will reveal itself." The villagers cheered. They had come to see more miracles, more wonders. They trusted him completely. But in the crowd, hidden among the people, stood Mom and Chib and Kesa. They had come with a plan. Mom and Chib held a small clay pot, filled with sacred herbs and river water blessed by the ancestors. It was an old magic, one older than even Pastor Ziba's dark master. The moment Pastor Ziba touched the next sick person, Mom on Chip struck. She stepped forward, lifting the clay pot high. "If you are truly sent by God," she called, "then let your power be tested." The crowd murmured in confusion. Pastor Ziba turned to her, his smile tight. "Mother, why do you doubt me?" Mom on Chip did not hesitate. She flung the contents of the clay pot at him. The moment the water touched his skin, Pastor Ziba screamed. A terrible sound, like 1,000 voices crying out in pain. His body convulsed. His white robe darkened, stained with an unnatural blackness that spread across his skin like ink. His eyes turned completely black, and then, from his mouth, a voice that was not his own spoke. "You dare betray me?" The villagers gasped in horror as Pastor Ziba fell to his knees, his body writhing. The ground trembled beneath him. Then, from the shadows, the creature appeared. Tall, with glowing red eyes, its form wreathed in smoke. It stretched out a clawed hand toward Pastor Ziba. "Your time is done," it hissed. Pastor Ziba screamed, clawing at the ground. "No. You promised me power. You said. You are mine now." With that, the creature lunged. Pastor Ziba's body twisted, his screams fading into the wind. His form shrank, shriveled, and then, nothing. He was gone. The villagers stood in stunned silence. Their mighty pastor, their anointed one, had been nothing more than a servant of darkness. Mom on Chip turned to them. "Let this be a lesson," she said. "A tree without good roots will always fall." The people fell to their knees, weeping, praying, seeking forgiveness. And as the first light of dawn broke across the sky, the village of Como rose anew, free from the shadow that had once gripped it. And Pastor Ziba? He was never seen again. But on some nights, when the wind howled through the trees, the villagers swore they could still hear a voice, whispering, begging, forever lost in the darkness.